The snow fell in thick, silent curtains over the town square, transforming the cobblestones into a blanket of white that muffled the sounds of the Christmas market. Lanterns swayed in the wind, casting dancing shadows across the faces of merchants and shoppers alike, all bundled in their finest winter coats. But Eleanor Hartley stood apart from the festive scene, her thin shawl doing little to protect her from the December cold, her fingers red and chapped as she clutched a worn leather satchel to her chest. She had been standing at the edge of the market for nearly an hour, watching families pass by with baskets full of candied fruits and roasted chestnuts, listening to the choir sing carols near the church steps. This was her third Christmas Eve without her parents, and each year the loneliness grew sharper, more insistent. The workhouse loomed in her recent past like a specter, and though she had escaped its walls 6 months ago, the memory of thin gruel and colder hearts still haunted her dreams. Eleanor was 22 years old, though the hardship of her life had etched lines around her eyes that made her appear older. Her brown hair, once glossy and thick, hung limp beneath a faded bonnet. Her dress, patched in several places, had been donated by a charity organization that had taken pity on her circumstances. She had no family, no prospects, and no future that she could see clearly. What she did have was a skill, one that her mother had taught her in the warm kitchen of their cottage before fever had taken both her parents within a week of each other. Eleanor could cook, not just simple meals, but the kind of food that made people close their eyes and remember happier times. She could coax flavor from the humblest ingredients, transform a tough cut of meat into something tender and savory, bake bread that filled a house with the scent of home. It was the only thing of value she possessed, and as she stood in the cold watching the prosperous families celebrate, she wondered if it would be enough. The notice had been posted at the Mercantile for 3 weeks. A rancher from the Western Territories was seeking a wife, offering passage and a home to any woman willing to make the journey. Most of the eligible women in town had laughed at the advertisement, speculating about what kind of desperate man would seek a bride through such means. Eleanor had read it 17 times, memorizing every word. She had nothing to offer a husband except her cooking, but perhaps, she thought, perhaps that might be enough for a man who had even less to offer than she did. That evening, as the Christmas bells began to ring across the valley, Eleanor made her way to the boarding house where the rancher was reportedly staying. The building was modest but well kept, its windows glowing with lamplight. She stood outside for several minutes, gathering her courage, before finally climbing the steps and knocking on the door. The landlady who answered looked her up and down with barely concealed disdain. Eleanor was accustomed to such looks. The poor learned to make themselves invisible, but invisibility did not serve her purpose tonight. "I'm here to see Mr. Thorne," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. About the advertisement, the landlady's eyebrows rose. "Another one. You're the 5th girl today. He's in the parlor, but I doubt you'll have any better luck than the others." She stepped aside, gesturing down a narrow hallway. Eleanor found him sitting near the fireplace, his back to the door. Even seated, she could tell he was a large man, broad, shouldered, and solid. His hair was dark, threaded with gray at the temples, and his clothes were clean but worn, the practical attire of someone who worked with his hands. When he heard her footsteps, he turned, and Eleanor saw a face weathered by sun and hardship, with eyes that held a deep weariness. James Thorne was 40 years old, and looked every day of it. His face was lined, his hands scarred from years of ranch work, and there was a heaviness about him that spoke of disappointments accumulated over time. When he saw Eleanor standing in the doorway, something flickered across his features, that might have been resignation. "You'll hear about the advertisement," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." Eleanor stepped forward, though she kept her distance. "My name is Eleanor Hartley." He studied her for a long moment, taking in her worn dress and thin frame. "The landlady tells me you're the fifth today. The others didn't stay long. I imagine you're wondering what's wrong with me, that I'd need to advertise for a wife." Eleanor met his gaze directly. "I imagine you're wondering the same about me, sir." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Fair enough. Sit down, Miss Hartley. No point standing on ceremony." She sat in the chair across from him, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. Up close, she could see the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped as though carrying an invisible weight. "I'll be honest with you," James said, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "My ranch is struggling. I've got 200 acres in Wyoming territory, decent grazing land, but I've been working it alone for 3 years since my partner died. I need help, plain and simple. I need someone who can manage a household, who won't run off when things get hard. The winters are brutal. The nearest town is 15 miles away, and the work never ends." He paused, watching her face. "The other women who came today heard all that and left before I could finish. Can't say I blame them." Eleanor absorbed his words, recognizing the honesty in them. "What happened to your partner, my brother?" James's voice dropped. "Thomas, he was thrown from a horse during a storm, broke his neck. That was 3 years ago. His wife took their children and went back east. Can't blame her for that either." "I'm sorry for your loss." He nodded, acknowledging her sympathy. "What about you? What brings a young woman to answer an advertisement like mine on Christmas Eve?" Eleanor took a breath. This was the moment she had been dreading, the moment when she would have to lay bare her circumstances and hope they would be enough. "I have nothing to offer you, Mr. Thorne. No dowry, no family, no education beyond what my mother taught me. I spent time in the workhouse after my parents died. I have no prospects and no expectations." She raised her chin, meeting his eyes. "I'm not worth much, sir, but I can cook." The silence that followed stretched between them like a held breath. James Thorne stared at her, and Eleanor forced herself not to look away, not to apologize for her poverty or her circumstances. She had stated the truth, and there was a certain dignity in that, even if it was the dignity of having nothing left to lose. "You can cook," James repeated slowly. "Yes, sir. My mother was known throughout our county for her cooking. She taught me everything she knew. I can make a week's worth of meals from ingredients most people would throw away. I can preserve food for winter, bake bread, smoke meat, make soap and candles. I can keep a house clean and manage supplies. I won't complain about the isolation or the work." She paused. "I know what it means to be cold and hungry, Mr. Thorne. I won't take food or shelter for granted." James sat back in his chair, studying her with new attention. "The other women who came today, they wanted to know about servants and social calls, and whether there was a piano. They wanted to know if I had money set aside, what my prospects were for expanding the ranch." He shook his head. "They saw a hard life and a man old enough to be their father, and they wanted no part of it. I'm looking for a home, Mr. Thorne, not a fortune." "Can you ride a horse?" The question surprised her. "I learned as a child, though it's been years. You'll need to learn again. Sometimes you'll need to help with the animals. Can you shoot?" "No, sir. I'll teach you. There are wolves, sometimes bears. You need to be able to protect yourself when I'm out on the range." He stood, walking to the window to look out at the falling snow. "I'm not offering you an easy life, Miss Hartley. I'm offering you a roof and food and work that will break your back some days. I'm offering honesty and respect, but I won't lie and say there will be comfort or luxury." Elena stood as well. "I'm not afraid of hard work, and I'm not looking for comfort. I'm looking for a purpose." He turned to face her. "Can you really cook? Give me a kitchen and ingredients, and I'll prove it to you." James Thorne studied her for another long moment, then nodded toward the door. "The landlady rents out her kitchen sometimes. Wait here." He left the room, and Elena heard him speaking with the landlady in the hallway, heard the clink of coins changing hands. When he returned, he gestured for her to follow him. "She's agreed to let you use the kitchen for an hour. There's a ham that needs using, and whatever else you can find in the pantry. Show me what you can do." The kitchen was warm and surprisingly well stocked. Elena removed her shawl and rolled up her sleeves, feeling the first stirring of confidence she had experienced in months. This, at least, was familiar territory. She moved through the space with growing assurance, assessing what was available, making decisions with the instinct born of years of practice. She found the ham, a good-sized piece that had been sitting too long, its edges beginning to dry. There were potatoes in a barrel, onions and carrots in a bin, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and a crock of butter in the cold pantry. Flour and sugar, eggs and milk, a precious lemon that must have cost the landlady dearly. Eleanor's mind raced through possibilities, settling on a menu that would demonstrate both her skill and her ability to make much from little. James Thorne sat at the kitchen table, watching as she worked. Elena was conscious of his gaze, but refused to let it fluster her. She moved with practiced efficiency, trimming the ham and setting it to braise with onions and herbs, dicing vegetables for a hearty soup, mixing dough for rolls that she shaped quickly and set to rise near the warmth of the stove. Her hands remembered the motions her mother had taught her, the way to knead dough until it was silky, the exact moment to add seasoning to a pot, the temperature that would coax the best flavor from meat. As she cooked, something remarkable happened. The tension that had been coiled in her shoulders began to ease. The fear that had been her constant companion loosened its grip. In this warm kitchen, surrounded by the tools of her trade, Elena felt like herself again for the first time since her parents had died. She was not a charity case or a workhouse girl or a woman with no prospects. She was a cook, and a good one, and that meant something. The kitchen filled with aromas that made James shift in his chair. The sweet yeast smell of rising bread mingled with the savory richness of braising meat, the earthy comfort of vegetable soup simmering on the back burner. Elena worked steadily, checking temperatures, tasting and adjusting seasonings, sliding the rolls into the oven at precisely the right moment. She glazed the ham with honey and mustard, added a splash of cider vinegar to brighten the flavors, let everything come together with the timing of a conductor leading an orchestra. When she finally plated the food and set it before James Thorne, she stepped back, wiping her hands on her apron. It's simple fare, but it's honest food. James looked down at the plate before him. The ham was sliced thin, glazed and glistening, surrounded by caramelized onions and roasted root vegetables. The soup was thick with vegetables and herbs, the rolls golden and steaming, split open to reveal a soft, pillowy interior. He picked up his fork slowly, as if the act of eating required consideration, and took a bite of the ham. Elena watched his face carefully, looking for any sign of his reaction. James chewed thoughtfully, then closed his eyes. When he opened them again, there was something different in his expression, something that might have been wonder. "My mother used to cook like this," he said quietly. "Before she died, when Thomas and I were boys, she could take anything and make it special, make it taste like home." He took another bite, then another. "I haven't had food like this in 15 years. Elena felt a knot loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was there. She sat down across from him, watching as he worked his way through the meal with the focus of a man who had been subsisting on beans and hardtack for too long. He tried the soup, nodded appreciatively, broke open a roll and spread it with butter, eating it with obvious pleasure. "Miss Hartley," he said finally, setting down his fork, "I'm going to ask you a question, and I want an honest answer. Can you do this every day? Not fancy meals like this necessarily, but good food, the kind that makes a hard day's work worthwhile." "Yes, sir, every day. Even when supplies are scarce. Even in the dead of winter when all we have is what we've preserved. Especially then, that's when good cooking matters most." James pushed his plate away and folded his hands on the table. The landlady had returned to hover in the doorway, drawn by the smells, her earlier disdain replaced by obvious interest. James ignored her, his attention focused entirely on Elinor. "I'll make you an offer," he said. "A partnership, not just a marriage. You keep the house and cook the meals, help with the ranch work when you're able. I'll provide for you, protect you, treat you with respect. I won't expect more than that until you're ready, if you're ever ready. We'll start as partners and see where it goes. Fair terms." Elinor's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Fair terms. We'd leave in 2 days, after Christmas. The journey takes 3 weeks if the weather holds. It's not too late to change your mind." "I won't change my mind." James stood and extended his hand across the table. Elinor stood as well, taking his hand. His grip was strong and calloused, the hand of a man who worked for his living. "Then I suppose we should find a preacher. If you're willing, we could be married tomorrow. Give you the protection of my name before we travel. I'm willing." The landlady gasped in the doorway, but Elinor barely heard her. She was thinking of the ranch in Wyoming, of the kitchen that would be hers to manage, of the purpose she would finally have again. It wouldn't be an easy life, but she hadn't expected easy. She had expected honesty and work, and the chance to build something, and James Thorne was offering her exactly that. They were married the next morning in a small church, with the minister's wife and the landlady as witnesses. Elinor wore the same patched dress she had worn the night before, and James wore his cleanest shirt. There was no wedding breakfast, no celebration, just quiet vows exchanged in the cold morning light. When the minister pronounced them married, James nodded at Elinor with the same gravity he had shown when accepting her offer of partnership, and she nodded back, sealing their agreement. They spent Christmas Day preparing for the journey, purchasing supplies and arranging for the wagon that would take them to the train station. Elinor used the last of her coins to buy flour and sugar, dried beans and salt pork, thinking ahead to the meals she would prepare on the trail. James watched her make her selections with approval, recognizing the practical mind behind her choices. On the morning they left, Elinor stood in the wagon looking back at the town where she had been born, where she had lost everything, and where she had found an unexpected chance at a new beginning. The snow had stopped falling, and the sun broke through the clouds, turning the white landscape into something that sparkled. It felt like an omen, though Elinor was not usually given to superstition. The journey west was hard, just as James had warned. They traveled by train and wagon, camping some nights in the open, staying in rough boarding houses on others. Elinor cooked their meals over campfires and on borrowed stoves, proving daily that her skills were real and not exaggerated. She made stews from tough meat and root vegetables, biscuits that rose high and fluffy despite being cooked in a Dutch oven over coals, coffee strong enough to cut through the morning cold. James, for his part, proved himself to be a man of his word. He was patient with Elinor's questions about ranch life, teaching her to build fires and purify water, showing her how to read the sky for coming weather. He never pressured her for more than she had agreed to give, maintaining a respectful distance even as they worked side by side. At night, they slept on opposite sides of their camps, and if James wished for more, he gave no sign of it. 3 weeks into their journey, they reached the ranch. It was late afternoon when the wagon crested a final hill, and Elinor got her first look at what would be her new home. The house was smaller than she had imagined, a log structure with a stone chimney, sitting in a valley between 2 ridges. Beyond it, she could see the barn and outbuildings, corrals for horses and cattle, and stretching away in all directions, the vast emptiness of the Wyoming Territory. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way. The sky seemed bigger here, the silence deeper. Elinor could see why James's sister-in-law had left, why the other women had turned away from his advertisement. This was a landscape that demanded everything from those who tried to tame it, that gave nothing easily. But Elinor had never expected easy, and she was not afraid of demands. James helped her down from the wagon, and they stood together looking at the house. "It's rough," he said. "I've been batching it for 3 years, but it's sound and it's warm, and it's yours now as much as mine." Elinor walked toward the house, her boots crunching in the snow. The door opened easily, and she stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit only by the last light of day filtering through small windows. There was a main room with a fireplace, a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, 2 small bedrooms barely bigger than closets. Everything was clean but sparse, the domain of a man who had been surviving rather than living. But Elinor could see the potential. She could imagine curtains on the windows, rugs on the wooden floor, shelves built for her cooking equipment. She could picture the kitchen filled with the smells of bread baking and stews simmering, could see herself standing at that stove, creating the meals that would make this house a home. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. That night, Elinor cooked her first meal in her new kitchen. She unpacked the supplies they had brought, inventoried what James had stored away, and made a simple supper of beans and salt pork with cornbread. It was humble food, but she made it well, seasoning it carefully, baking the cornbread until it was golden. They ate at the rough wooden table, and when James finished, he looked at her with something that might have been contentment. "Welcome home, Mrs. Thorne," he said. The winter was as brutal as James had warned. The snow piled high against the house, and the wind howled down from the mountains with a ferocity that shook the walls. There were days when James could not tend the animals without roping himself to the house to keep from getting lost in whiteout conditions. The isolation was complete, the nearest neighbor 10 miles away, the nearest town 15. But Elinor thrived in ways she had not expected. She had purpose now, and purpose was a powerful antidote to loneliness. She cooked 3 meals a day, each one crafted with care, each one bringing a moment of pleasure to their hard lives. She baked bread twice a week, the rhythm of kneading dough becoming a meditation. She experimented with the preserved foods James had stored, finding ways to make them interesting, to coax flavor from ingredients that had been sitting too long in the root cellar. She learned to manage the house in the extreme cold, to keep fires burning through the night, to melt snow for water when the well froze. She learned to shoot, practicing with James's rifle until she could hit a target reliably. She learned to read the behavior of the animals, to know when a storm was coming by the way the horses moved restlessly in their stalls. And slowly, as the winter wore on, James began to change. The weariness that had marked his features began to lift. He started talking more, sharing stories of his childhood and his brother, of the dreams that had brought him west. He laughed occasionally, a rusty sound at first, as though he had forgotten how. He began to anticipate Eleanor's company, to come in from his work earlier than necessary, drawn by the warm kitchen and the smell of food cooking. One evening in late February, after a particularly good meal of roasted venison with wild mushrooms Eleanor had preserved the previous fall, James set down his fork and looked at her directly. "I need to tell you something," he said. "When you answered my advertisement, I thought you were desperate. I thought you'd work hard because you had no choice, because going back to the workhouse would be worse than anything I could offer." He paused. "I was wrong. You work hard because you care about the work. You make a home here not because you have to, but because you want to. I just wanted you to know I see that. I see you." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. It had been so long since anyone had truly seen her, had recognized her worth beyond her ability to serve. "Thank you," she managed. "No," James said. "Thank you. You've given me something I didn't even know I'd lost. You've given me a reason to come home at the end of the day." Spring came late to Wyoming that year, but when it arrived, it transformed the landscape. The snow receded to reveal meadows of new grass, and the animals that had huddled through the winter spread out across the range. Eleanor discovered a garden plot behind the house, overgrown but still usable, and she spent her days clearing it and preparing it for planting. James helped her in the evenings, and they worked side by side in a companionable silence that had grown comfortable between them. One afternoon, as Eleanor was planting seeds she had saved from the previous owner's stores, James came to stand beside her. "I have something to ask you," he said, "and I want you to know you can say no." Eleanor sat back on her heels, looking up at him. The afternoon sun backlit his figure, and she could see the strength in him, the steadiness that had carried him through hard years. "What is it?" "This partnership we have, it's been good, better than good. You've made this place feel like home again, and I find myself grateful every day that you answered my advertisement." He crouched down beside her, meeting her eyes. "But I find myself wanting more. Not because our agreement isn't enough, but because I've come to care for you, Eleanor. I want to be a true husband to you, if you'll have me." Eleanor's breath caught. She had not expected this, had not let herself imagine it. But as she looked at James, at the sincerity in his weathered face, she realized that something had shifted in her as well. The partnership they had built over the winter had grown into something deeper, something that felt like the foundation of love. "I'd like that," she said quietly. "I'd like that very much." They were married in truth that night, not in a church with witnesses, but in the home they had built together, with only the stars as witnesses. And if Eleanor had any doubts about her decision to answer that advertisement on Christmas Eve, they vanished in the warmth of James's embrace, in the certainty that she had found not just a home, but a partner who valued her for exactly who she was. The years that followed were not easy. The ranch struggled through droughts and harsh winters, through cattle diseases and market fluctuations. But Eleanor and James faced everything together, building their partnership into something that could weather any storm. Eleanor's kitchen became known throughout the territory, and neighbors would ride for hours to trade for her preserves and baked goods. She taught other ranch wives her techniques, sharing the knowledge her mother had given her, building a community in the isolation of the frontier. They never became wealthy, never achieved the comfort that the other women who had rejected James's advertisement might have wanted. But they built something more valuable than wealth. They built a life of purpose and partnership, of mutual respect and growing love. They built a home that, while humble, was filled with warmth and good food, and the knowledge that they had each found exactly what they needed in the other. And every Christmas Eve, Elena would make a special meal, recreating that first dinner she had cooked for James in the landlady's kitchen. They would sit together at their table, older now and worn by their labors, and James would close his eyes as he ate, savoring not just the food but the memory of the night when a desperate woman, with nothing to offer but her cooking, had become the answer to every prayer he hadn't known he'd been praying. "I'm glad you answered my advertisement," James would say, the same words every year. And Elena would smile, remembering the girl she had been, standing in the cold market square with no prospects and no hope, and would reply, "I'm glad you gave me a chance. It was enough." It had always been enough, and in the end it was everything.